Okay, today, of course, in previous weeks, we have looked at the Gospels, introduction to the survey in Gospels, and today we're going to be talking about Paul the Apostle, a little bit of background and history, and then the first of the Pauline epistles. Today we will talk about the first 5. These are not in the order they appear in Scripture. These are the order in which they occurred chronologically. Galatians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Then next week we will talk about the second section of Pauline epistles, which would be Romans, Philemon, Colossians, Ephesians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. Again, these are in chronological order. Hi, Barbara.
Sorry.
That's all right. You got your greeting on tape. I'm sure that's what you're looking for. Or on tape, video. Where am I today? So, the thing about the Pauline epistles, Paul, of course, wrote 13 of the books of the New Testament. The biggest section of it are the Pauline epistles. An epistle is simply, it's our word from the Greek that means letter. That's all epistle means, is letter. And the books as they appear in our New Testament are not arranged according to chronology. They're arranged according to length. Romans being the first one because it is the longest. Theologically, it's probably also the most significant because it is sort of Paul's ultimate thesis. But the order, and when I look at a list of order in a few minutes, that in which they were written actually is valuable because Paul's first letter, Galatians, is very powerful, but very sort of straightforward and single message, very simple. By the time you get to Romans, his theology has gotten much more advanced, if you will, in terms of him addressing more issues with regard to it. And then toward the end of his life, 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy, which is actually the technical order, but we do the 1st and 2nd Timothy together. There's a very different tone because Paul is approaching the end of his life. The letters were written from prison. He knows he is not going to survive much longer, and so it's a very, very different kind of feel. So it's valuable to get a sense of Paul's life, the development of his theology, not that he changed it, but rather he just got more, as he worked with it more, he developed a more extensive kind of theological explanation for things, as opposed to the more simple that he'd had earlier. And so we'll be getting into it according to that order. This is Paul. Paul is always, you can always tell Paul and Peter. Paul is always bald, which means he was a handsome man. Paul is always shown with his hair, and if it's more than just a bust, kind of head and shoulders, he always is carrying a book because of the fact he's responsible for writing 13 of the books or letters in the New Testament. If you see, in fact, down here below, this is Paul in the center, Timothy, and I think it's Titus. I'd have to, the Greek, I think that's Titus. Being the people that traveled with him, worked with him, etc. That actually, the mosaic in the bottom right is a picture I took at a chapel for Paul and Lydia in Philippi. Lydia, the woman who comes to faith at Philippi, there's a chapel built there to them, and this is one of the mosaics that's available. On the other hand, whereas this is always what Paul looks like, and one where, to greater or lesser extent, you can always recognize him, Peter has two characteristics. One, he's always carrying keys, because of the statement that Peter was given keys to the kingdom. And second, he has hair like Norm Piper. It's thick, silver gray, curly kind of hair, very different than Paul. And so I don't have a picture of him here, but maybe I will when we do the Peter section. So this is what Paul looks like. These are various. This is from a church, a very ancient church in Turkey. The upper one is from Patmos, where it's from the monastery of St. John on Patmos, Patmos is where John the Apostle wrote the book of Revelation, but they have pictures of others of the apostles there as well in the monastery. And then the lower right one, as I say, is from the chapel of Lydia in Philippi. So here's three different locations, 2 different continents, but he always looks very much the same. This was how he was represented. Now, Paul, of course, did not start out as a Christian. In fact, he didn't start out as Paul. He started out as Saul. And it is quite often in Scripture that people, both Old and New Testament, people have a major spiritual event in their life. Their names would often change. Abram became Abraham, Sarai became Sarah, Simon became Peter, etc. This is often the case. Well, he had been Saul, and the early travels of Saul and then Paul would, for simplification, I'll continue to call him Paul, even though he wasn't Paul at the start. He was a young Pharisee from Tarsus. Tarsus is up here. It was in the province of Cilicia. This is the Eastern Mediterranean, obviously Jerusalem. This is Judea, Syria, with Damascus there. He started out in Tarsus. He was trained as a Pharisee. He was very well educated. His teacher was Gamaliel. Gamaliel, who was a part of the Sanhedrin, who's the most famous teacher of his day. He is quoted in the New Testament as being the one that stands up when the Sanhedrin is trying to force Peter and John to stop preaching the gospel of Yeshua, Jesus, as Messiah. Gamaliel asked them to step outside, and he speaks to the Sanhedrin and says, we've had a lot of people come along before who claimed they were the Messiah, or they knew who the Messiah was, and they've all died off, been killed, been driven away. None of them have gone anywhere. The same thing will happen with these guys if they're false. If they're not false, if this really is of God, then the last thing in the world we want to do is try to suppress it. So just leave them alone. So that was Gamaliel. That was Paul's teacher. He was a man of great wisdom. Well, Paul's first appearance to us is that during the stoning of Stephen was the first Christian martyr. He was one of the deacons of the early church. Stephen, in the book of Acts, gives this extraordinary sermon, almost a teaching, looking back at the Old Testament and how it testifies to the fact that Jesus is the fulfillment of the messianic expectation. Well, following that, they stone him. So he's the first person to die for his faith, the first martyr. And the men who were stoning Stephen, Paul, the apostle, who was then very much against this, what he thought was a heresy, the Christian heresy, he's holding the cloaks of the men who were doing the stoning. Afterwards, he receives kind of a commission. He's deputized by the Sanhedrin to go out and capture these heretics, these Jews who are now proclaiming that the Messiah has come. And so he's in the process of doing that. From Jerusalem, from Tarsus down to Jerusalem, which is where he received much of his training. That was the center of Jewish culture. He's headed north toward Damascus because he's heard there are some of these Messianic Jews, Christianized Jews, in Damascus, and he's going there to arrest them. When he is, and this is all in the book of Acts, it's not in Paul, but this is background for his letters. When he sees a bright light which knocks him down, everybody always says he was knocked from his horse. He wasn't riding a horse. Horses were only for soldiers. And there's no indication in the scripture that he was even riding a mule, which might have been possible. It just says he was struck to the ground. But all the artists have always representing him falling off a horse when they paint the thing. He heard the voice of Jesus saying, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And also the voice said, why do you kick against the goads? When an animal, like a sheep, was in a pen, they would goads would be sticks that stuck through the slats in order to keep the animals from, pushing against the sides and maybe breaking the fence down. It was something to protect. But the goads were these things that would, jab you. And in this case, the control that Jesus is talking about speaking to Saul, why are you kicking against the goads? Why are you struggling against the truth, in effect, is what he's saying. And so Saul is stricken blind. He travels north and is in Damascus and is blind there, and probably trying to figure out what all this means, because Jesus identifies himself to Saul. I'll just keep going to Paul now. In Damascus, he is there and he's blind, and Ananias is a man, not the Ananias of Ananias and Sapphira who got struck dead, a Christian, gets a vision from God, a message from God, to go to this particular place on the street called Straight, to find this Saul, to heal him of his blindness, and to begin to teach him. And from that point, Saul begins to learn of the Christian faith. He now believes because he had the vision and heard the voice of Jesus. And he later goes for a time into the Arabian desert for meditation, prayer, perhaps other training. We don't have details on that. And then comes back to Damascus. Later on, from Damascus, he goes back to his hometown of Tarsus, up here. And from Tarsus, you can see desert, back down to Jerusalem, up to Caesarea, and then up to Tarsus. One of the leaders, not technically, but accepted as one of the leaders of the early church, was Barnabas. Barnabas' name literally means the son of encouragement. Bar means son, and Nabus would be encouragement. So the son of encouragement. Barnabas was very well respected, very much accepted by the church. He has heard about Paul and goes to get him and finds him in Tarsus. Brings him back to Antioch, which is where Barnabas was staying, and that became the base of operations from that point on for Paul's ministry as well as for Barnabas and Silas and others. He is taken down to Jerusalem by Barnabas, introduced to some of the people, and Barnabas, who they trust, really vouches for him and says he really has had an experience of the risen Jesus. You really need to pay attention to this guy. Okay, so this is how he ended up coming to the faith. When he went back to Antioch with Barnabas, they ended up starting the first church that had regular Gentile members. Now, that's not the first Gentile converts. Those were the Cornelius the centurion and his family, a Roman centurion, in Caesarea, which is right there, which was the center of the Roman control of this area. It was a Caesarea Maritima, it was called, named after Caesar. It was a port that they built. Fascinating stuff back then. The Romans had techniques of construction we still have not been able to replicate. About a year and a half ago, they finally figured out how it was that the Romans had created waterproof cement. All of these places that they built around the world that are still there, some of them obviously are stone, but some of them are made out of cement that they created, and we didn't know how they did it. They finally just figured it out. With Caesarea Maritima, what they did was they built a bay, harbor, by taking these barges out, loading them down with this Roman concrete, which was waterproof, and then sinking them. And they sunk enough of them that they created a breakwater for this huge harbor. Right? Again, we are just now figuring out some of how they were able to do some of that stuff. Some of their water technology and things like that. These aqueducts that were carrying water halfway across Europe. So Caesarea was the center of the Roman control there, and it's a place that Paul was from time to time. In fact, he spent over 2 years in prison there before he eventually went to Rome. But we'll get to that in a minute. So that's just Paul's background, and he ended up being a companion of Barnabas and was responsible for really launching the church into other parts of the world. Now, during the day of Pentecost, as recorded in Acts 2, Peter preached a great message of salvation in Jesus, and the people who heard him were from all parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. They were from as far away as Rome, Alexandria, Libya, Syria, all these different places that had come there, Jewish people, for the festival. They heard Peter's witness sermon. 3,000 of them the first day accepted Jesus. Well, they were baptized, they began to be taught, but then they went back home. Which means that some of these converts had carried the message back to Rome. Later on, we have Priscilla and Aquila coming from Rome, so we knew there were converts there. Apollo coming from Alexandria, before we have record of anybody else taking the message there. But in terms of really spreading the gospel, Paul is the one most responsible for that. And I'm going to show you next his missionary journeys. He had, depending upon how you count them, he had either 4 or 5. 3, 4, or 5. Explain that. So, Paul really was considered secondary to Barnabas when they first started out, and very quickly that changed. But I should have. Last week, did I show you the maps of the expansion of the Christian faith?
Yes.
Okay, how quickly it spread. So you get some idea. Paul was more responsible for that than anybody. Paul considered himself the apostle to the Gentiles, and Peter the apostle to the Jews. Having said that, every time Paul went into a town, the first thing he'd do is go to the Jewish synagogue and preach, the Messiah, because he was Jewish, Jewish Pharisee. At one point he gets so frustrated with the Jews' reaction, he shakes his cloak out in the street and shakes the dust off and says, I'm not going to have anything more to do with you Jews. The very next time he goes into town, first thing he does is go to the synagogue. He could not give up on the Jews. So the first journey that Paul and Barnabas took was from their home base in Antioch. This is where it starts. They took a boat to the island of Cyprus, landed at Salamis, and then crossed the island to this town of Paphos. During the time on Cyprus, up until this point in the book of Acts, which is where this is recorded, even though we're talking about Pauline epistles now, Barnabas had been listed first, Barnabas and Paul. Well, on Cyprus, Paul performed several miracles, and he also speaks, and people hearing his sermons are being converted. And by the time they leave Cyprus and go up here and land at Attalia, which is, this is modern day Turkey. It was called Asia Minor, the whole region at that point. When they land by the time they land at Attalia and Perga, they were both these cities, they have changed so that Paul is now listed first. Paul is the leader. Paul has been accepted by everyone who hears them as being the prominent figure. And Barnabas was okay with that, because Barnabas was a great man, he was a humble man, and if God was going to use Paul, he was fine. The person who apparently wasn't fine with it is John Mark. Barnabas' nephew, John Mark, who is the man who wrote the Gospel of Mark later. He ended up leaving them right after they landed on the coast of Asia Minor, and it's commonly believed that it was because he was upset about the fact that his cousin Barnabas was no longer the one seen as being primary, that it was now Paul, and Paul was being the primary spokesperson. At any rate, when they landed here, they traveled up and visited the cities of Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. These are the churches of Galatia. There's always been a controversy. You'll hear about the northern Galatia theory and the southern Galatia theory. Prior to the Romans, Galatia was a province up here, okay, up in the north part of Asia Minor, up on the Black Sea. But the Romans renamed the provinces, and they called this area, the whole area, Galatia. And so some people think that Paul was actually ministering in churches further up north, but we have no record of that. Because the Romans called this Galatia, we believe those are the churches he's referring to when he wrote the book of Galatians. So they visit all these places, and among other things, he meets Timothy, a very young man whose mother and grandmother have both become Christians. And Timothy, his mother had been Jewish, his father was Greek, he'd never been baptized, he'd never been circumcised. And so that happens later on. But after visiting these, they backtrack, they come this way, and then from Attalia, today that's a resort town called Attalia. Beautiful beaches, beautiful hotels. It's quite something. And there are some great ruins not far from there, Roman ruins. From Attalia, they take a boat and go back to Antioch. All right? And then from Antioch, they go back down to Jerusalem. And one of the reasons is because they end up giving testimony in Acts 15, the Council of Jerusalem meets to determine whether or not Gentiles can be followers of Jesus without first becoming Jews. Acts 15, the council meets and talks about that, and it was very important that Barnabas and Paul, who had started a church in Antioch, which has Gentile believers, and they've seen that God has blessed them, the Holy Spirit has come upon them, then they go down to Jerusalem and give testimony, and the decision is that no, a Gentile does not have to become a Jew first in order to become a Christian, a follower of Jesus. All right? So this is the first missionary journey. The second missionary journey started out being complicated because Barnabas and Paul were going to go together on a second journey, but Barnabas wanted to take John Mark again. And Paul said, no, he deserted us last time, we're not taking him this time. So they actually split up. And Paul ended up leaving Antioch and taking with him Silas. This is where Silas comes in. He was part of the Antioch church. And they traveled overland up through Cilicia to these same towns, part of the same towns that they had visited in Galatia. At the same time, Barnabas and John Mark leave by boat, and they visit Cyprus and have their own missionary journey, which we don't hear a whole lot about. But from these churches which he had visited before, and at that point Timothy joins them. He picks up and starts traveling with Paul and becomes one of his primary assistants. They travel over to Troas, which is near the ancient city of Troy, which has been discovered since then. Right? Troas is a port city, and in Troas, Paul has a vision at night of a man of Macedonia which is over here. Okay? This is all what we call Greece today. But then it was Macedonia and Thrace. Paul has a vision at night of a man of Macedonia saying, come over and help us. If you, and so he decides, with Silas and Timothy, that they're going to do exactly that. And they leave Troas. They have one stopover in Samothrace, an island, and then end up in Neapolis. Today that's the city of Kavala. And you can go to Kavala, and in Kavala, in the middle of town, and we just stumbled across it, there is this huge mosaic, which on one side of the mosaic, it's got, and it's like on a corner of the street, it's got Paul asleep and having a vision of this man, and on the other side, they've got the man of Macedonia that he had a vision of, and Paul stepping ashore. This is where the gospel, in terms of any intentional missionary kind of activity, was carried from Asia to Europe. This is Asia. This is Europe. Okay, so this is where it crossed over. They landed at Neapolis, today known as Kavala. You can go there, it's a nice town. Then they went to Philippi, from there Amphipolis, then Apollonia, Thessalonica, Berea, and they had some problems in there because there were apparently some ruffians in Thessalonica that didn't like his message and were thugs that were going to chase him out of town. They were hired to chase him out of town because the Jews didn't like what he was preaching. They went to Berea, and in Berea, I went to Berea College, and Berea is the town where it says that they were much more open to the truth of the Scripture than the previous people they'd run into. But these thugs from Thessalonica follow him, so Timothy and Silas put Paul on a boat, which is why this is in the water, in the Aegean Sea, and send him down, and he goes down to Athens. That's where he has the very famous interaction with the Athenian philosophers on Mars Hill, and it's called the Areopagus. Well, Ares is the Greek name for Mars. You know, Mars is the Latin or Roman name for the same god as Ares. And so Mars Hill and Areopagus are the same thing. Good grief. Yeah. I don't think we have tracks out there, so somebody made a wrong turn somewhere. Have you all been to Athens? Okay, to the Parthenon. Well, the Parthenon is this plateau that sits right in the middle of Athens. And on it are the Acropolis and a number of other temples to various of the gods. It was built during the Golden Age of Greece. Right at the bottom of the Parthenon, quite literally, I mean, it's very near where you go up the steps to get up to the Parthenon, or right for the Acropolis rather, there is just this big boulder. I mean, it's as big as the sanctuary, you know. And there are steps that lead up on top of it. It's flat on top. That's the Areopagus. That's Mars Hill. And it's just this huge piece of rock. And that's where philosophers used to gather in Athens and debate philosophy and talk about gods and all of that sort of thing. And so Paul has a discourse with the Athenian philosophers there. He then leaves from Athens and goes to Corinth. And then from Corinth, he ends up taking a boat back to Ephesus. From Ephesus, he gets a boat back to Paphos on Cyprus, and then back down to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem back up to his home in Antioch. That's the second missionary journey. And this is important, and we'll look at this later, because a number of the letters that he wrote later were written to churches that he planted in these places. First, the churches of Galatia, the church in Thessalonica, that's Thessalonians, the church in Philippi, that's the book of Philippians, the church in Corinth is the books of Corinthians, in Ephesus, it's the book of Ephesians. All of these are churches that Paul was responsible for either planting or encouraging, that he later writes back to help deal with some of the problems they're having. Okay? By the way, just you'll notice the crosses here. There are 7 of those. Those are the 7 churches of the book of Revelation. The Apostle John, at the start of the book of Revelation, writes, in the letter of the Revelation, writes to the 7 churches as a different message for each one of them. Well, these are the ones that have crosses on them. And if you go to those places, now there are ruins. In some cases, there actually are ruins of Christian churches. Turkey is now 98% Muslim, so there are not a whole lot of churches left standing. Although prior to the last couple of years, it actually was a very stable, secular country. And Erdogan, the current president, is just blowing everything up. Nobody, in terms of things have gotten very bad there. Everybody's canceling travel. You know, part of it is his reaction to ISIS and those folks, because down here, Syria touches Turkey, and that's where a lot of the conflict is on the Turkish border. And so he's been very bad for the country. Not that I have a political opinion about that, but when we were in Turkey, very stable, you know, very open, very positive, even though it's predominantly Muslim. It's a very secular state in terms of how they run themselves. Well, these 7 crosses are the 7 churches, and you can visit all of them except for Thyatira. We didn't go to Thyatira because there's nothing there. There are no ruins left. And so that's the one of the 7 that we didn't go to. But there are extraordinary things at Pergamum, Smyrna, which is actually right on the coast, beautiful hotels and things there. Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea, and Colossae, which we'll talk about later, the book of Colossians. He was writing to the church in Colossae, and he refers to the fact that he had also written a letter to Laodicea, and that he wants the Colossians to share their letter with Laodicea and to read the letter he wrote to Laodicea. We don't have that letter. You know, the letter to the Laodiceans is lost, but we know that it existed because he refers to it in his book to Colossians. Okay? Any questions about all that? Yes?
When Paul received his eyesight back after, when he got his eyesight back.
He didn't.
Well, when Ananias, was it Ananias?
Oh, you mean when he was no longer blind? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I was thinking about the fact that he had bad eyesight his whole life. Sorry.
No,
Yes.
why didn't he get perfect eyesight back? Ask God.
Yeah, I have an answer. I don't. You know, we don't even know.
He heals it.
We don't even know for a fact that eyesight was his problem. Paul refers in his letters to the fact that 3 times I asked God to take away the thorn in my flesh, and 3 times God said, my perfection, my strength is made perfect in your weakness. And in other places, for instance, he says, I know that you cared for me in Galatia. You would have plucked out your own eyes to help me. And then in 2 places he says, this closing I'm writing with my own hand, see what large letters I use. All of those things added up suggest to us that the physical problem that he had, that he refers to, was really horrible eyesight. And they didn't have optometrists or glasses or anything like that. One of the reasons why he always had a secretary writing things down, although that was common in those days anyway, is because he apparently couldn't see well enough to write. He had to have somebody help him when he traveled. And so sometimes just to show that it really was him and that he really did have affection for these people, he would scrawl something in large letters by his own hand. Usually it was written by what's called an, amniocentesis. No, by an amanuensis. An amanuensis, that's different. It's like, I once told a friend of mine, a very funny woman that Carolyn and I know, that a primary field of study for me had been epistemology. And she said, I think my mom got one of those. So, yeah.
Just more out of curiosity, you know, just look at the journey. How long, and I'm assuming they would either be on a donkey or on foot.
Or by boat.
Or
by boat. If it's
by boat. Well,
yeah.
I'm talking about going from Jerusalem to Antioch. So are we talking like several weeks, a month? How long? I don't...
Yeah, the distance, people would travel quite often between the Sea of Galilee, which is right there, and Jerusalem. You know, in fact, because they didn't like going through Samaria, you know, the whole woman at the well and all that, is they often would, from Galilee, they would cross over to the Transjordan, the east side of the Jordan River, and go down and then cross back over to get to Jerusalem. But, so they would go further. We're talking a journey of probably 3 or 4 days there. Okay, if you're just making for it. But that's all reasonably flat. You get up here and there are huge mountains, you know, and over in here as well, that they had to cross. And there were certain passes. That's one of the things that had been made easier by the Romans. 2 things. One of the reasons that the 1st century AD was the perfect time for the gospel to be spread is because the Romans provided peace, the Pax Romana. They would not, you know, they wouldn't stand for bandits. You could travel by sea or you could travel by land with relative safety. It didn't mean completely safe, but probably safer than we might run into these days traveling by land, you know, by ourselves. The Romans made it possible to travel. They also built roads. The Roman roads, many of them still exist, these huge flagstone roads, which meant that to do that, they would sometimes carve out peaks. They didn't have big land working equipment, but they had a lot of slaves. And so they would cut through, low passes and mountains. They would provide roads along coastlines, and that made it much easier to travel. Those two things, plus the fact that at this point everybody spoke Greek. Whatever other language they may speak, they also spoke Greek, which meant everywhere you went, you could talk to people. Because if they were Macedonian, there was a Macedonian language, but they would also speak Greek. If they were Jewish, they would speak Hebrew and Aramaic, which they had learned when they were in captivity in Babylon, which is Chaldean. But they would also speak Greek. That's why the New Testament is written in Greek. That's thanks to Alexander the Great, 300 years before this, traveling through and turning everybody into Greeks. So all of those things, plus the fact that by the 1st century Rome had conquered all of this was part of Rome. There were no borders, there were no passports, there was nobody who could try to stop you if you, particularly as in the case of Paul, he was a Roman citizen. Nobody could, there were no barriers to him going from one area to another. All of those things are part of what made it possible for the gospel to spread so quickly, and especially through the ministry of Paul as he traveled to all these places. Okay, make sense? So yeah, Barbara, you were asking, for him to get from Antioch over to Troy could have taken months and months, depending upon how long he stopped in each place, and and weather, and all that kind of stuff.
Because that was a 3-year journey, right?
Yeah. Yep. And he did stop over in different places. For instance, this journey, the 3rd journey, when he travels similar route, Antioch, he goes a little further north, comes back down and stops at Ephesus. He stays in Ephesus almost 3 years. That's the longest period of time he spent in any one place. He was almost 2 years in Corinth. So those were the 2 places he invested the most. But in Ephesus, and then later he sent people. Timothy was later sent to Ephesus to be the head of the church in Ephesus. Titus was sent to Rhodes and was the bishop of Rhodes later on. In Corinth, Apollo, who, as I mentioned, Priscilla and Aquila had taught, and he had been, he was an early leader of the church. He's one of the people that they proposed might have written the book of Hebrews, although I tend to think it was Priscilla. He was Paul's emissary and the one who really led the church in Corinth. So even Paul would spend periods of time in these places to either plant the church or to encourage the church or lead them. He would write back to them, but in particular, he would send people to help be their leaders and to care for them. And he and Titus, for instance, on Rhodes, they made a point of one of the major responsibilities there, and he talks about this in Titus. Titus talks about the requirements for somebody to be an elder, because when Paul was there, he and Titus were beginning to appoint leaders for the church, and then Paul had to leave, and he wrote back with further instructions to Titus in order to appoint people to lead the churches that were being planted. Okay? So, 3rd missionary journey, and you can see the dates on each of these. From Antioch up here to Ephesus, he spent 3 years, and then he took a boat across again to Thessalonica, and he made a loop from Thessalonica overland back down to Corinth. Then the intention he has on the 3rd missionary journey in the book of Acts was to then get a boat and head back. He wanted to try to get back to Jerusalem by a certain period of time, and he was prevented from doing that because he found out that there were people who were trying to kill him, and they were planning to get on board whatever boat he was going to get on and kill him en route, throw his body in the ocean. And so instead of that, he decides to go back overland. He goes back up here, and then in Thessalonica, he's able to catch a boat. And, in Neapolis, he's able to catch a boat. He goes down, visits Troas, and this time he sort of skips Ephesus. I'm sure he felt like it's like visiting a relative. If I go there, it's going to take me forever to get away. But he sent word ahead, and he's sort of island skipping here. He pulls into the port of Miletus, which is south of Ephesus, and the leaders from the church in Ephesus meet him there, and he has a chance to say a final goodbye to them and bless them and all that kind of stuff. He then gets back on the boat and again skips around, and then from Lycia here, he takes the boat over to Phoenicia, Sidon and Tyre, and then down to Jerusalem. Now when he gets to Jerusalem, along the way, by the way, there were various prophecies that occurred. There's a prophet named Agabus who took Paul and wrapped his belt around Paul's risks and said, this is what's going to happen to you if you go back to Jerusalem. You know, you will be arrested. And Paul said, if I am, I am, but that's where I need to go. So Paul gets back to Jerusalem. I just looked down and said Rome. Gets back to Jerusalem, and he is in the courtyards of the temple, and some Jews recognize him, and they jump him, you know, and they're beating him up. Well, the temple in Jerusalem had a Roman fortress, the Antonia fortress, built right into the outside wall. So that the Roman soldiers could literally come right out of the Antonia fortress into the courtyards of the temple. And that was because that's how they sort of kept control of things. Well, when this caused a riot, the Roman soldiers come out, they grab Paul, and they drag him off into the Antonia fortress, and then later bring him back out, and he's having a hearing in front of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, Paul was so smart, the Sanhedrin was made up of Sadducees and Pharisees who really didn't like each other. Fundamentally, they disagreed on issues of theology. One of the things they disagreed on was the Pharisees believed in resurrection, bodily resurrection. And there were other theological things. The Sadducees did not. They didn't believe in life after death. They didn't believe in resurrection. So when the Romans bring Paul in to the Sanhedrin and they say, well, speak for yourself, first thing Paul says is, the reason I am here today is because I've been preaching the resurrection. The Pharisees who were there go, we like this guy. And the Sadducees say, no, down with him. Well, the Sadducees and Pharisees start fighting each other. Maybe not physically, they're yelling at each other, whatever. And so the Romans take Paul out. And they take him back into the Antonia fortress. And word comes from Paul's nephew is sent that a group of Jews have pledged themselves that they will not eat again until they have assassinated Paul. He was accused of bringing Gentiles into the temple court, which he had never done. He'd been seen with Gentiles in Jerusalem, but not into the court because that was forbidden. There was a sign there that said, any non-Jew who enters here forfeits his life. You know, it's a big deal. So, and you're not a non-Jew could not enter a Jewish home, and vice versa. You know, all those things. Well, when the word comes that they're going to assassinate Paul, the guards in the Antonia fortress decide they better shuffle him up to Caesarea pretty quick, which is the Roman center. And he is taken up there, and that's this, from this point, he is taken up to Caesarea, and from Caesarea, well, right there, and from Caesarea, he's there for 2 years. The governor at that time was quite corrupt, and he eventually gets thrown out by his Roman bosses. And a new governor comes in. And Festus is meeting with Paul and listening to him. They believe that the reason that the previous governor had not done anything for 2 years is that he kept hoping Paul would pay a bribe. And they thought, well, if this many people are out to get this guy, then he must be worth something. Maybe he'll give me a bribe and I'll let him go. Well, Agabus and then Herod Antipas, who was one of the local governors, comes in. Paul speaks to Festus and Antipas, and he's talking to them about the faith. Festus has this great statement: "Is Paul, you know, your great learning has driven you mad. Do you think that I will become a Christian?" And they were saying, well, maybe we should return him back to Jerusalem and let his own people deal with it. Well, Paul knew that was a death sentence, and so Paul says, "I am a Roman citizen, and I declare my right to be my case to be heard in Rome," which is a Roman citizen. He had a right for that. Well, afterwards, Festus and Antipas are talking, and they say, you know, if he hadn't said that, we would probably just let him go. But since he declared his right to go to Rome, then to Rome he will go. So that's why Paul is taken by ship from here up around Cyprus. You'll notice they're staying close to the coast because this is the time of year when there are a lot of really bad storms in the Mediterranean. They were right at the edge of the season where they didn't really take long trips. And Paul warns them, says, this is not going to go well if you guys keep sailing. Well, along the way, he apparently makes good friends with his guards. At one point, they have a storm, and they're afraid that they might sink, and whenever a Roman guard was in danger of losing a prisoner, their instructions were to kill the prisoner, but don't let him escape. And so one of the guards is saying, shall we kill them? And the chief centurion says, no, don't do anything. So they keep traveling along here. They run from here to Crete, and then the longest piece they have to take open water here, and they run into a terrible storm. In fact, they are shipwrecked on the island of Malta. And there's some extraordinary things there. Paul is bitten by a serpent, and he shakes it off in the fire after it bites his hand, and they all say, well, he's going to be dead in a few minutes, because nobody survives that. And it has no effect on him, apparently. And he ends up being recognized by a lot of people there that this is no ordinary guy. And the Roman centurions, the Roman soldiers are apparently supportive of him. The local people, the local governor is converted while he's there. And then later, they take him up to Syracuse on the border of Sicily, and then up to the toe of Italy, up to the coastline, and then finally to Rome. The book of Acts ends with Paul under house arrest in Rome. And that's the last definitive statement we have about Paul. But we have Paul's letters, which, while unlike the book of Acts, it doesn't say, and then Paul went here, and then Paul did that, and then he went here. Paul clearly suggests in his letters that he had intentions of visiting some other places. And the timeline is such that we do not believe, scholars do not believe, that Paul died the first time he was in prison in Rome, after his third missionary journey and then his journey to Rome. Sometimes people refer to this as the fourth missionary journey, because there were people that got converted along the way. And then he went to Rome, and the household of Caesar, which probably means the guards, some of them were converted, because Paul later sends greetings to his brothers in Caesar's household, which means those who worked for the emperor. And the generally accepted, not by everybody, but by more people than not, is that Paul was released from imprisonment in Rome, and that he took another journey. In Romans, he mentions that he intends to go to Spain, that he really wanted to go to Spain. Now, all of this is part of Rome. Rome controlled Spain, they controlled Britain. So this is, the scripture doesn't tell us the details of this, but there are traditions about Paul arriving in places. He talks about, in some of his letters, about some of the activities in places. So we believe that probably what happened is that when he left Rome, he came back over this way, back to Crete, and then up to Nicopolis, which is in Achaia, what we know of as Greece today, and then came back and went to Spain. From here, it cuts down here. And from Spain, some people believe that he went further. He went all the way up to Britain. There are strong traditions in Spain that Paul visited there. It's possible he could have gone to Britain as well, because Britain was it was Roman Britain. In fact, Britannia is a Roman name. And then from that point, he comes back, and it's believed that he came back from England and Spain, went to Rome. He's rearrested. He's put in, see, he was under house arrest the first time. The second time he was arrested in Rome, he was put in the Mamertine prison. How many of you all have been to Rome? Okay. The Mamertine prison, which is near the Forum, you know, where all the pillars and everything are, very near there, the Mamertine prison is like an aljibe. It's basically a big open hole in the rock with an opening barely big enough for a person to drop through. And that's where tradition has it. Both Paul and Peter, prior to their executions, were imprisoned in this big aljibe, this big stone hole in the ground. And for the Romans, when they imprisoned somebody, they often, not always, but often didn't bother to feed them. If they didn't have friends or family that would bring food and water and, blankets and clothing for the cold and everything else, then people died. Because they thought you're imprisoned and it's up to you. In some cases, they were a little more generous than that. But and then from that point, we get 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy, which are the last of the prison letters. In fact, Philippians is a prison letter too. And eventually Paul's death. The tradition is that Peter was crucified because he was a Jew. He was not a Roman citizen. Romans were not allowed to be crucified. The story is, or tradition is, that because Jesus was crucified, Peter said, I'm unworthy to die as my Lord died, so would you crucify me upside down? And that's the tradition of Peter being crucified upside down. And then Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, was beheaded. It's better than, it's like in England, in the old days, if somebody was a member of royalty, nobility, and they committed a crime that called for the sentence of death, they would hang them with a silk rope. I'm sure that made it better, as opposed to a hemp rope, right? So this is the last journey of Paul. So, and this calls it the fifth missionary journey. Again, it depends on, he had three for sure, Some people call the trip to Rome, the fourth one, a missionary journey, and then call this the fifth one. But we don't. This is not written about in the book of Acts, and so we don't have exact details. This is our best estimate based upon other clues that we find in his writings. All right? Any questions about that?
Why was Paul arrested a second time?
Well, for preaching. It would have been considered, for them it was considered sedition. Most of the early Christians, as long as Christianity was considered a sect of Judaism, they were left alone by the Romans. Because Julius Caesar had really liked the Jews, and he had given them a special dispensation, which all of the emperors after them agreed to, that because they were very learned, they were very bright, they were good business people, Caesar had respected them greatly, and so he said, leave them alone. And all the other emperors did as well. As long as the Christians were thought of as being part of Judaism, they were left alone. Particularly, Nero in the 60s A.D., so this was the time of Paul still, he started the first persecution, but it was isolated primarily in Rome, and that's because Nero needed somebody else to blame for Rome burning down. No matter what he did, they kept saying he had done it because he wanted to rebuild Rome the way he wanted it. And there's no real historical evidence of that, but that was the rumor. Finally, Nero says, I got to blame somebody else for this to get it off my back. And so he looked around, and the Christians were not popular with common people because they wouldn't hang around with them. They wouldn't go to any event where there was a recognition of other deities, etc. So he picked on them, and there was a very intense persecution in Rome at that time. Most of the other Roman persecutions happened in the 2nd century and later, particularly after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 130s, when it officially became recognized that Judaism and Christianity were different. All right, but often Christians were persecuted because they refused to worship the emperor. They refused to acknowledge the emperor as a deity. They refused to make offerings to the emperor, and this is what got a lot of them in trouble. It's like, if you didn't make offerings to Athena or Artemis or whatever, they didn't have nearly as much heartburn. But if you didn't offer to the emperor as a deity, that was considered sedition. You were going against the government, and therefore you were dangerous, and they persecuted for that. Okay? These are the 13 letters of Paul in chronological order. First, the book of Galatians, written about AD 49. There's a few people who think that 1 Thessalonians may have been first. I'm not one of those people. I think that it is, Galatians is first. Galatians is one of the two books, one of the first books it's one of two books that would have been the first one in the New Testament. The other being the book of James. Either Galatians was first and James was second, or James was first and Galatians was second. And if you look at it, it's very interesting that those two are a complement to one another. So whichever one was written first, whether James, the half-brother of Jesus, who was head of the Jerusalem Council, wrote the book of James first, and then Paul wrote Galatians as kind of a balance for it. It's not contradictory, but the book of James is faith without works is dead. And the book of Galatians is works won't save you. That's not a contradiction. Actually, how you act, Paul was very clear, how you act is important. It makes a difference. But that's not, getting circumcised, doing the works is not what saves you, it's faith. Okay? Or perhaps Galatians was written first and then James wrote his book, aware of it in sort of balancing that. Because the danger is somebody reads James' books first and they go, okay, as long as I do all the stuff I'm supposed to do, I'm okay. No, you have to have faith. It's the heart. Or if people took Galatians and read it first, they'd go, oh, it doesn't matter, what I do, as long as I have faith. Neither one of those things is true, and those two books balance each other in that regard. Okay? Then 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, these to the church in Thessalonica. 1 and 2 Corinthians to the church in Corinth. And you've got here also where they were from, we believe. Then, these are the ones we're going to talk about still this week. Then, next week we'll talk about Romans, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, Philippians, 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy. And this little chart is online if you want to pull it down. You can go and get the PowerPoint. Very handy. In fact, there may be something similar to this in your book. I'm not sure. Under the Paul section. I'd have to go back and look at it again. Any questions about any of that? Paul, obviously one of the most important people in the history of the church, responsible for spreading the gospel in a way that nobody else individually did. there were a lot of people did a lot. Mark went to Egypt, Thomas went to India. We have various of the apostles and disciples going to various places and planting churches. But in terms of the scope of area that he touched on and the number of churches he planted and then encouraged and the impact that he had through the writings, there's nobody else quite like Paul. Not even Peter had the level of impact that Paul did. Unless you're Catholic, and then you may think so. So, okay, I tell you what, let's take a break because we're going into actually talking about the books next, starting with the book of Galatians. So I've got 5 minutes till. Let's come back in here at 5 minutes after. Okay?